I had heard the legends before. Everyone who grew up around the forests of northern Arizona had. The skinwalkers, evil beings that could take on the appearance of any living thing. My grandmother used to tell me the stories when I was young. "They'll steal your skin," she would say, her voice lowering into a gravelly whisper. "And once they have it, they'll be you. No one will know the difference. Not until it's too late." When I got older, I dismissed those stories as nothing more than folklore. But what I experienced last year in those same woods made me believe. It was late autumn, just before the winter cold really set in. A few friends and I had decided to go on a camping trip to escape our city lives for a few days. We were looking forward to fresh air, campfire stories, and the peacefulness that only the deep forest can offer. There were 4 of us, me, John, Maria, and Dylan. We were close friends who had known each other since high school, so this was supposed to be just another carefree trip. We found the perfect spot, deep in the pines, far from any trails. The first night was uneventful, laughing, roasting marshmallows, sharing old stories. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. Around midnight, Dylan decided to head out into the woods to relieve himself. He was gone longer than expected, but no one thought much of it at first. We joked that maybe he was trying to scare us or had gotten lost. But when he finally came back, something was wrong. He didn't say much, just sat by the fire, staring into it. I asked him if he was all right, and he just nodded slowly, but his eyes looked hollow. There was something unsettling about his silence. He wasn't the type to brood. Dylan was always the loud, jokey one in the group. Maria noticed it too and asked, "Did something happen out there?" Dylan turned his head slowly towards her, and in the flickering light of the fire, I swear I saw his eyes catch a strange, animalistic glint.
"I'm fine,"
he said, his voice flat, almost monotone. The way he spoke sounded wrong, like someone trying too hard to sound like him. John shrugged it off, saying he was probably just tired, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Dylan barely moved for the rest of the night, just sitting, staring, occasionally shifting in a way that made his bones seem like they were struggling to fit inside his skin. I couldn't sleep that night. Every noise from the forest sent a jolt of anxiety through me. There was an oppressive stillness in the air, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Around 3 a.m., I heard something outside the tent. It was a low, guttural growl, followed by the soft crunch of footsteps on pine needles. I stayed still, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The growling grew louder, then faded, like something was circling our camp. I was too afraid to go out and look. The next morning, Dylan was gone. His sleeping bag was there, his gear was untouched, but he had simply vanished. We searched the surrounding area for hours, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. We were miles away from any other campers, and Dylan wasn't the type to just wander off. By noon, Maria started crying, convinced something terrible had happened. John and I decided to hike back to the main trail to try and find help. Before we left, we all agreed that if Dylan came back, Maria should stay in the camp until we returned with help. John and I trekked for hours, but couldn't find the trail. It didn't make any sense. We had marked our way when we came in, but now the woods seemed different, like the landscape had shifted overnight. Shadows grew longer, and the forest felt denser, more claustrophobic. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, lurking just out of sight. Then we heard it.
"Help!"
It was Dylan's voice, faint but unmistakable. It came from deep within the trees to our left. John immediately started running toward the sound, but I hesitated. There was something off about it. The voice sounded distorted, like a recording played too slowly.
"Help me!"
This time it was closer. John called out to Dylan, but there was no reply, just the sound of leaves crunching underfoot in the distance. I grabbed John's arm, stopping him from running further. "Something's wrong," I whispered. But before I could explain, there was a noise, low, like a rumble. And from behind the trees emerged Dylan, or something that looked like him. At first glance, it seemed like our friend. Same height, same clothes, but the way it moved wasn't right. It jerked forward, its limbs too loose, as if it didn't fully understand how to use them. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and the skin around its mouth stretched too wide when it grinned at us.
Hey guys,
Its voice slipping into a grotesque mimicry of Dylan.
I found the way back.
John was about to run to him when I grabbed him again, pulling him behind me. "That's not Dylan," I whispered, my voice shaking. The thing smiled wider, stepping closer, its movements twitchy, like a puppet on tangled strings. Its eyes gleamed with a hunger that froze me in place.
Come on, I'll show you.
But the voice was wrong. It sounded like Dylan, but it didn't feel like him. There was a coldness behind the words, a cruel mockery. John looked confused, torn between running to his friend and trusting me. I didn't wait to see what he chose. I grabbed his arm and bolted. We ran as fast as we could, hearing the thing behind us, its steps growing faster and more erratic. We didn't stop until we burst into our camp, where Maria stood pale-faced, staring at the fire. "It came back," she whispered, her voice hollow. I followed her gaze and saw what she meant. Another Dylan sat by the fire. His back was to us, but his breathing was slow and deliberate, like he was waiting. "I told you," Maria said, shaking. "He came back, but—" The Dylan by the fire stood up slowly, turning to face us. But now, up close, we could see the cracks. His skin was too tight in some places, too loose in others, and his eyes, glassy, black like a predator's, focused on each of us with an unnatural intensity.
Why did you run?
The voice warping into a deeper, more guttural tone. We didn't stay to find out what it would do next. We grabbed our gear and ran, not looking back. The entire time we could hear it calling after us, its voice shifting between Dylan's and something far more ancient, far more monstrous. We made it back to civilization the next morning, but Dylan was never found. The authorities said it was a case of a lost hiker, that the forest was too vast, too wild to search for long. But we knew the truth. The thing we saw in the woods that night wasn't human. It had stolen Dylan, worn his skin like a suit, and tried to lure us in too. Now, whenever I hear those old legends of the skinwalkers, I don't laugh anymore, because I know they're real. It's been almost a year since that horrific night in the pines, and I'd love to say that I moved on, that time healed the wounds, that the nightmares faded. But they didn't. They just got worse. It wasn't just the guilt of leaving Dylan behind. It was the creeping, suffocating sense that whatever thing was out there in the woods had followed us back. The first few weeks after the camping trip were tense. Maria moved out of town and wouldn't talk to John or me. She claimed it was just too painful to be reminded of what happened, but deep down, I think she was afraid. Afraid of what she saw that night, and afraid it wasn't over. John tried to stay in touch, but he wasn't the same either. None of us were. He stopped responding to texts after a month. I'd occasionally see him around town, looking gaunt and jittery. His eyes were hollow, the same way Dylan's had looked by the fire. That was the last time I saw him before he disappeared. People say John just packed up and left town. They claim it was the trauma, that he wanted a fresh start somewhere far away. But I know better. I know the thing that took Dylan never let us go, and now it had taken John too. I tried to carry on, but there was always this lingering dread. Every time I went outside at night, I felt watched. Shadows in the corner of my eye seemed to move, and sounds from the woods felt too deliberate, like something trying to mimic the natural noises of the forest. Then last week it happened. I was walking home late one evening, the sky bruised with the last light of dusk, when I heard it.
Hey!
It was a whisper, almost too soft to catch, but it was unmistakable.
Hey, man!
My blood ran cold. It was John's voice, distant but clear. I froze, glancing around the empty street. He sounded close, too close, but there was no one there, just the wind stirring the trees.
I'm over here.
I turned and saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, half hidden by the shadows of the towering pines. My heart hammered in my chest, and I stepped forward, straining to see who it was. It was John, or at least, it looked like John. He waved me over, grinning that same crooked smile he always had.
I found something out here.
His voice thin and hollow, just like Dylan's had been.
Come check it out.
Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the figure in the woods. It looked so much like John, but the longer I watched, the more wrong it felt. His movements were jerky, almost like he wasn't fully in control of his body. His head twitched to one side too quickly, too sharply.
I don't have all night, man.
The grin stretched wider. I forced myself to step back. "John," I called, my voice shaking. "Is that really you?" The figure in the woods tilted its head, the smile faltering for just a second, and then it took a step toward me. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I ran harder and faster than I've ever run in my life. I didn't stop until I was back at my house, locking every door, drawing every curtain. But I could still feel it, him, out there, waiting. For the next few days, I kept inside, only venturing out during the daylight, but even then I could sense something was wrong. I started hearing John's voice everywhere, outside my house, in the supermarket, even in my own backyard. It would call to me, softly at first, then more insistent.
I found the way back.
It would say in that twisted imitation of his voice.
Why did you run?
I tried to tell myself it was just the stress, just my mind playing tricks on me. But then Maria called me, out of the blue. She hadn't spoken to me since she left town. Her voice was frantic, barely a whisper, and she kept saying she was being followed, that she'd seen Dylan. "He was outside my apartment," she whispered, her voice cracking with terror. But it wasn't him. It looked like him, but his skin. Oh God, it was too tight, like it didn't fit him anymore. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I tried calling her back, but there was no answer. The next day, I learned that she was gone. No one had seen or heard from her since the night she called me. I knew then that there was only one thing left to do. I had to go back to where it all started. Back to the pines. I packed my gear and drove to the forest, the same route we'd taken a year ago. The trees seemed taller, darker than I remembered. There was a weight in the air, as if the forest itself was alive and watching. I parked the car at the edge of the woods and walked in, following the old path we had used on our camping trip. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own footsteps, crunching on the dead leaves. It didn't take long before I started hearing it again. The voices, first Dylan's, then John's, then Maria's, all calling to me from the trees, begging, whispering, mocking.
Why did you leave us?
Come back.
We found the way.
I ignored them, pressing on, but every step made it harder to keep my sanity. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to warp around me. Trees bent at strange angles, and shadows moved where there shouldn't have been any light. And the voices, they grew louder, more insistent. Finally, I reached the clearing where we had camped. The fire pit was still there, now covered in moss and overgrown with weeds. But there was something else. Standing in the center of the clearing were 3 figures: Dylan, John, Maria. Their faces were blank, their bodies stiff, as if they were waiting for me. Their skin, loose in some places, too tight in others, barely seemed to hold them together. And their eyes, cold, dead, and filled with hunger.
We're so glad you came back.
Their voices blending into a hideous chorus.
We were waiting for you.
I stumbled back, my mind reeling with the impossibility of it all. I could feel the air around me grow colder, sharper, as if the forest itself was closing in. Then they started to move, slowly at first, their limbs jerking in unnatural angles, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. They began to surround me, their grins widening impossibly, skins stretching in grotesque ways. And in that moment, I realized the truth. These weren't my friends anymore. They hadn't been for a long time. They were skinwalkers now, and they wanted me to join them. Before I could think, I turned and ran. I didn't stop, didn't look back, not even when their voices chased me through the trees, growing fainter and fainter as I neared the edge of the forest. I made it out. Barely. But I know this isn't over. The skinwalkers are still out there, wearing the faces of my friends, waiting for their next victim. They'll come for me soon. The voices haven't stopped. Every night they scratch at the walls of my mind, growing louder, more desperate. I hear them just outside my window, whispering in the dark, calling my name. John, Dylan, Maria. Their voices blend together, a haunting chorus of lost souls trying to drag me back to the forest. I know it's only a matter of time before the skinwalkers come for me. In the weeks since my last encounter, I've tried everything to escape. I thought I could outrun them, move to a different town, change my name, even abandon my life altogether. But wherever I go, they find me. The thing about the skinwalkers, they don't need to follow you physically. They get into your head, into your dreams. And once they're there, there's no running, no hiding. I've come to accept that the only way out is to confront them. I have to end this once and for all. It's not about survival anymore. It's about closure. I spent days preparing. I researched every legend, every story, every whispered word about skinwalkers, trying to find any weakness, any way to stop them. The stories were always vague, conflicting. Some said they could only be killed with silver. Others said fire was their only weakness. But one thing was clear. To defeat them, you had to face them on their own ground. In the woods. In the place where they first found you. So I'm going back. Back to the forest. Back to where this nightmare began. The drive up to the pines is eerily familiar. The memories of that first trip flooding back with every twist in the road. The sky is overcast, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. As I park the car at the edge of the woods, I realize I'm not afraid anymore. I'm ready. I've got a gun loaded with silver bullets, a makeshift torch, and every ounce of determination I can muster. I enter the woods just as dusk begins to settle, casting long, creeping shadows through the trees. The forest is silent, unnaturally so. No birds, no insects, just the faint rustling of the wind through the pines. It feels like the trees themselves are watching, waiting. I follow the same path we took a year ago, the memories of that night playing in my mind like a broken record. The fire pit, Dylan's hollow stare, the figure that looked like John. It all comes rushing back, but I push the thoughts away. I need to stay focused. The deeper I go, the more the air thickens, almost like it's alive, pressing down on me with an invisible weight. And then, just as I reach the clearing, the voices start again.
Why did you leave us?
It's Maria this time, her voice trembling with emotion.
You could have saved us.
I don't answer. I can't let them get inside my head again.
You were our friend.
Dylan's voice calls out, low and hollow, dripping with accusation.
You left me to die.
I grip the gun tighter, my knuckles turning white. You're not real, I whisper to myself. You're not them. The clearing comes into view, the same one where we camped that first night. The fire pit is still there, now cold and overgrown with moss. And standing in the center, just like before, are three figures. Dylan, John, Maria. They look even worse now, their skin hanging off their bodies like ill-fitting clothes, their eyes black and empty. But their smiles, those grotesque, unnatural grins, are the worst. They stretch too wide, pulling their faces into something inhuman, something monstrous.
We've been waiting for you.
They say in unison, their voices blending into one hideous, guttural tone.
It's time to join us.
I raise the gun, aiming it at the thing that looks like Dylan. I'm not here to join you. My voice steadier than I expected. I'm here to end this. The Dylan thing cocks its head, that sick grin never fading.
You can't kill us. You'll only become one of us.
I pull the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoes through the forest, and the thing's head snaps back, but it doesn't fall. Instead, it straightens up, its grin widening as the wound in its forehead begins to close, the flesh knitting itself back together like nothing happened.
Silver won't save you.
It hisses, its voice twisting into something animalistic, something ancient. I take a step back, the weight of my failure sinking in. The stories had been wrong. Silver doesn't work. But I have one more weapon. Fire. I grab the torch from my pack, lighting it quickly as the three figures begin to move toward me, their limbs jerking and twisting like broken puppets. The air around them ripples, distorting like a heat wave, and their voices become a deafening cacophony in my ears, overlapping, shrieking.
Why did you leave us? Why didn't you save us?
I thrust the torch forward, and the flames catch the edge of the Dylan thing's clothes. For a moment, it doesn't react, but then slowly, its smile falters. The fire spreads, crawling up its body, and a sound, like a low, guttural growl, rumbles from its throat. The others back away, their empty eyes flicking between the fire and me. For the first time, I see something that looks like fear in their faces. I step forward, swinging the torch in wide arcs. "Stay back!" I shout. "You're not them! You never were!" The flames crackle louder, and the Dylan thing collapses, its body writhing as it's consumed by fire. The smell of burning flesh fills the air, and I gag, but I can't stop now. The thing that looks like John lunges at me, its limbs twisting unnaturally as it moves, but I'm ready. I shove the torch into its chest, and it lets out a screech that reverberates through the trees. Its skin begins to bubble and blacken, and soon it too falls to the ground, writhing and screeching as the flames devour it. Only Maria is left now. She stands there, watching me with those cold, dead eyes, her smile gone, replaced by something almost human. Sadness.
You could have saved me.
Her voice soft, almost pleading. For a brief moment, I hesitate. She looks so much like the Maria I knew, the friend I had failed. But then I remember, this thing isn't Maria. It never was. I raise the torch one last time, stepping toward her. I'm sorry, I whisper, my voice cracking. But you're not her. And with that, I thrust the torch forward. The flames catch, and the thing that wore Maria's skin lets out one final, terrible scream. The forest is silent again, the oppressive weight lifting as the last of the skinwalkers burn. I drop the torch, my hands shaking, my body drained of every last ounce of energy. It's over. I stand there for what feels like hours, staring at the smoldering remains of the creatures that once wore my friends' faces. There's no satisfaction, no victory, just a hollow, aching emptiness. The skinwalkers are gone, but so are my friends, and I know I'll never truly be free of the nightmares. I turn and walk back through the woods, the shadows no longer moving, the voices finally silenced. But as I reach the edge of the forest, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me. The pines are quiet, but they'll never be safe again. Because some things, once they find you, never truly let go. And deep in the heart of the forest, I know the skinwalkers are waiting for the next traveler to wander too far into their domain.